I don't think every prayer has to be in a temple, and I don't think every meditation has to be on the mat. I spent some time with Steph Curry. We did a Facebook watch together, Steph versus the game, and we talked about his jump shot as an act of devotion, his jump shot as a prayer. So I think there are different ways for us to pray. In some ways, our life can be a prayer. Our life can be an affirmation. Our life can be a meditation.
How are you?
Oh, it's been a while. Pretty good. Thanks for reaching out. It's exciting that you're on the radio now, huh?
Yeah, it is exciting. Thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time out to chat with me. I know you're super
Of
busy.
course. Of course.
Dean of Religious Life at USC. You oversee almost 100 religious groups on campus. The
That's
first
right.
Hindu to take on the position, and for a long time, the only non-Christian. So I'm honored. And you're friends with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, which big deal.
I feel really lucky. My grandfather's mother was very close with Kasturba Gandhi, who's Mahatma Gandhi's wife. And so my grandfather, as a child, grew up around Mahatma Gandhi. And my wife, her family's from South Africa, and they were part of the ANC. And so her family grew up around the leaders of the anti-apartheid movement, including Mandela. And
Wow.
I got to spend time with the Dalai Lama. And so as we raise our daughter, we're trying to raise her with this legacy that your family has been part of these movements. These are movements not just for political and social liberation, but also for spiritual liberation, that there's a connection between social justice and our own spiritual lives and how we act and move in the world. And so I just feel really blessed to have been around these spiritual geniuses and try to convey their wisdom to my students and my daughter.
I was going to ask you that because you have so much to pull from, because I'm sure that you also learn from your students and you've studied so many religions. How do you find cohesive spirituality at home? Like, how were you able to build? Like, did you and your wife have to narrow it down? Did you have that conversation when you were about to have your daughter, or how did that work?
Well, I read a book that kind of changed my life. It's called The Spiritual Child by Lisa Miller. She's a professor out of Columbia University. And she had a data point that has been the most important data point in terms of my own role as a father. And that is that if you have an intergenerational spiritual experience growing up, that means if you go to temple or mosque or masjid or gurdwara or church with your parents or grandparents growing up, if you have a experience that allows you to understand your place in the world, that acknowledges life events, and that creates a sense of ritual and awe in your life, you are 80% less likely to suffer from depression as a young adult. And what I see on my campus is I see a generation that has largely been raised without religion. Almost 50% of our students were raised without religion, as opposed to 2% of their grandparents. So it's a significant shift in American religious history. But I also see a crisis, emotional, mental, and spiritual health crisis of anxiety, of depression, of suicidal ideation, and at the root of it, it's loneliness, it's disconnection, it's the sense that we don't belong. And so for me, just having any experience with my daughter, whether it's formally religious or not, that allows her to understand her place in the universe, her relationship to other people, that brings ritual and awe and wonder into her life, that connects her with people across generations. That's sort of the way I'm trying to raise her now, because I feel like I see the consequences of Lisa Miller's work in my work as Dean of Religious Life.
Right now, my generation, I feel like I'm a millennial, so I feel like we kind of strayed away from the institutionalized church and
Yep.
tried to curate
Yep.
our own experiences. But
Yep.
now you mentioned a mental health crisis in your students
Yep.
currently, and I think that's like a nationwide situation that's happening. Do you see now that they're turning back to spirituality in order to find coping mechanisms that are effective?
Yes, 40% of college students turned to a new spiritual practice during COVID. And so, for many students who weren't raised with religion, COVID is maybe a first opportunity to think about how my actions affect other people. We're asking students not to do certain things to save people they've never even met. They can see causality, they can see interdependence in a way that religion has historically provided a framework for. They understand that there's a place in the universe for them now, not just a place in the world. And they see the limits of some of the things that got us here, our screen addictions, our abuse of animals, structural racism, et cetera. They're beginning to see that when we go back, we don't have to go back to the way things were. We can go back to a new normal. We don't have to go back to those things. We can recreate a future, a world that we want to live in. So there is hope, possibility, and transformation. there's nothing more religious than the idea of transformation. Religion essentially is about transformation, about rebirth, about renewal, about reconciliation, about telling a new story. And I think COVID, in some ways, has allowed our students the opportunity to do that.
You mentioned before that religion is about answers or getting the answers, and spirituality is about asking questions over and
Yeah.
over.
Yeah.
Do you feel like in some ways that lacks resolution? You know, like that you don't ever feel a sense of closure, or like you're
Yeah.
grounded as a result of constantly having to ask questions in order to fulfill your spiritual needs.
I think part of it is just the way we were raised. We were always raised to find the right answers, and students have been rewarded for finding the right answers. The reason why students are at USC is because they've had the right answers to all their quizzes, all their tests, all their standardized exams, all their interviews. They've always had the right answers. No one's ever asked them what are the right questions. And so I think it's a cultural thing that we don't feel closure when we ask the right questions. But if we can sort of reorient ourselves around the questions, live and breathe the questions, what we begin to see is that the answers might change, but the questions don't. The questions that make us human are the same at 5, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50, even though the answers might change. The question of who am I? What does my life mean? How do I find meaning and purpose? How do I translate my values into action? How do I live my dreams? What's my relationship to others? Those questions endure. The answers might change, but the questions endure. So actually, if the questions endure, if the human questions endure, then we should find some kind of stability in that as opposed to uncertainty. And so I really
Wow.
want to challenge our students to think about the right questions and not just the right answers, because the answers change, but the questions don't.
Because you interact with all these students and all these religious groups, you get all this information. Does it ever dilute your spiritual walk, or does it enhance it?
I don't always practice what I preach. It's much easier to give people advice than to take your own advice. I don't feel like I am fully there often for the people I need to be there for. And so I think it is true when you're on the front lines of caregiving and when you see so much trauma in the world, it's easy to internalize that and not have it to sublimate it in ways that are unhealthy. And so I think for me, my challenge has been to also try and keep a piece of myself for my family and for the people I love. I haven't always been successful at that, but COVID in some ways has given me the opportunity to see what I've been missing. I'll miss some parts of this COVID experience, even though it's been horrifically tragic and disruptive, and it's been terrible in so many ways.
Right.
But I think it has allowed us to appreciate each other more. It has brought families together in ways they might not have been. We go on bike rides around our neighborhood and play board games in front of the fire and have 2 meals a day together. Like, we never did that before. When I think about the COVID period, I'll also think about those moments of gratitude and awe and connection and intimacy. And my sense is I'll miss those moments.
Yeah, agreed. The first time we interacted, it was really powerful for me because I was a grad student at USC and I was having like a quarter life crisis. And I'm like, I don't know what to do. I work at a music label, but I'm in journalism school, but I'm also like intrigued in spirituality. Where's my place in the world? And you said, well, that's what sets you apart. And I'll never forget that. And that changed me forever. And for you, I realized, well, that's true for you too, because your spiritual upbringing is so diverse. Can you speak to growing up Hindu and having a Buddhist grandfather, and like how that brought you to where you are today?
Yeah, thank you for that. As a Hindu, I was raised with a core Hindu belief that there are many paths up the mountain, but we're all going to the same place. And so I never saw it as my faith is better than yours, or there's only one truth, or there's an exclusive truth. I always saw it as a journey to understand other people's perspective, as a way of understanding who I am, of seeing myself in other people's experiences and vice versa. And so having a family as diverse as mine, I have family on almost every continent representing every religious tradition. Like, my family dinners, Thanksgiving dinners, are like the parliament of the world religions. We really are a diverse family. We look like the world. I think that's helped me with my job, not having a hierarchical attitude about exclusive truth claims, and understanding different faith traditions helps me as the chaplain to a university that has 90 religious groups and students from 150 different countries, and 50 chaplains representing every faith, including a humanist chaplain for atheist students. And so I do think that my upbringing prepared me to do the job, even though I didn't realize that until I actually got the job.
Do you feel like you're living your purpose?
On days, there are days where I do feel like I'm living my purpose. I think this has been an extraordinarily difficult year for so many people. It almost felt like an apocalyptic year. The
Yeah.
global plague, social unrest, structural racism, locusts descended upon India. I don't even know if there's anything more biblical or apocalyptic than locusts. I was like, really, this is really, like right out of the playbook.
Right.
And so, I think it challenged all of us to reimagine our purpose, to understand that there's an urgency to our life, to not take anything for granted. What was interesting for me is that 25% of Americans have thought about leaving their job during COVID, even though there's great economic uncertainty and turmoil, which means that in some ways, COVID gave people a chance to say, maybe this isn't my purpose. Maybe this isn't my best life. If life is so fragile, if the world can change overnight, I can't take things for granted, if I were to die tomorrow, how would I want to live today? And so I think a lot of us are going through those kinds of inner conversations or conversations with our family. And my sense is that after COVID, people will act and move in different ways, and that includes professionally as well.
It seems like, and we've just mentioned that you're big on like the questions and continuing to ask
Yeah.
yourself those questions. What do you know for certain? What is one thing about spirituality or your spirituality personally that you know for certain?
Yeah, I think maybe the only thing I know for certain is that I don't know anything for certain. I'm not sure I have that kind of certainty about anything. But I do believe that, at the end of the day, whatever we might identify as, whether it's a traditional identification markers or what have you, we're all human. And the work that I'm trying to do is the work of a human level. What animates us as humans? What are our goals? What are our fears? What are our aspirations? I think we need to get back to our humanity. We need to get back to a shared sense of responsibility. My concern is that we're beginning to see each other through the lens of the other, and there's no way to engage the other. The reason I want to be at a college is because I want people to learn and love each other in a way that they wouldn't be if they couldn't. The whole world is on a college campus. This is a way for you to meet people who are very different than you and to see yourself in each other's experiences. What we know is you can learn about other people, but when you know someone else, that's really what changes hearts and minds, is the knowing. And
Right.
so I I want to. COVID has taught me that, has reaffirmed my belief that we have to get back to what is human. And so during COVID, I've tried to just do the little things that make us human. A small act of kindness, a smile at someone you might not know through a mask, a prayer of gratitude at night, a walk on the beach. The big things are the small things, and those are the things we take for granted. And those are the things we have control over, by the way.
Yeah. You have spoken about meeting the Dalai Lama when you were 20 and having this mystic experience under a tree. Can you tell me about that and what that was like for you?
Yeah, that was the experience that changed my life. I was 20 years old. I was studying Buddhism in Bodh Gaya, which is a place in India where the Buddha was enlightened. It's like the center of the Buddhist world. And it was October 2nd, and that is Mahatma Gandhi's birthday. Because I was raised with a Gandhian family, and because my grandfather had this relationship with Gandhi, that day has always meant a lot to me. And so I remember it was Sunday morning, and I said, I'm going to go meditate under the tree of the Buddha's enlightenment to honor this day. And I was there at like 5 or 6 in the morning. The sun was rising. There were like a dozen of us under this tree. It was Mahatma Gandhi's birthday. And I hear this laughter, and I open my eyes, and the Dalai Lama is walking towards me. And I'm like, wow, I must be full on like hallucinating. This is a really deep meditation here. Am I levitating? Like, what's going on?
Right.
But it was really him. And when he is around that area, he pays his respects. And so he just kind of popped in and led us in meditation under the tree of the Buddha's enlightenment on Mahatma Gandhi's birthday. As a 20-year-old, that was the most extraordinary experience I had. And what was extraordinary for me wasn't anything he said. It was just who he was. It was the joy that was coming out of him. It was so, all we did was look at each other and laugh and laugh and laugh. And I felt like it felt like there's this teaching where the Buddha holds up a flower and someone smiles and that person becomes enlightened, right? There's these non-verbal transmissions of experiences and wisdom especially in the Buddhist tradition, that get you to a different kind of enlightenment, a non-semantic expression of enlightenment. And I could see that's where he lived. And maybe I got to taste it for a second, but that's where he lived. And here's a man who's seen great tragedy, a man who's lived his life in exile, a man who's seen over 1 million Tibetans killed since the Cultural Revolution, over 6,000 monasteries destroyed, a man who every day welcomes Tibetans who hike across the Himalayas to get to him, a man who's seen unspeakable hardship and trauma and grief, and yet his natural state was joy. And I began to think, well, what do I have to complain about? Like, how could my natural state not be joy, given
Right.
the privilege that I have? And so that was transformative for me. That experience changed everything.
The story in and of itself just made me feel light. And you speak to like one of the four noble truths in Buddhism, which is life is suffering, which is
Yep.
interesting, an interesting paradox when you're talking about him being full of joy. So
Yep.
how do you reconcile that? Like
Yeah.
life is suffering,
Well,
but
that's a great question. Yeah. Joy is, to me, is not happiness. Happiness is the trap. Happiness comes and goes based on the external conditions of the world. I could buy a car, I'm happy. I could crash the car, I'm sad. But joy comes from inside. And joy doesn't mean you're always happy. I've seen the Dalai Lama cry on numerous occasions, break down, sob, embrace people, right? But he comes back to this place of joy, which is an internally generated, I think, emotion. The other person who I feel is like this is Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who was a great hero for my wife growing up under apartheid in South Africa. And Desmond Tutu has also seen unspeakable horror, and yet he ran the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He saw it firsthand, he lived it firsthand, and yet his natural state is laughter. And when the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu, who are friends, wrote a book together, what did they call the book? They called it the Book of Joy. Not the book of happiness, but the book of joy. And so for me, joy can be part of suffering. Joy can be part of sadness. Joy is internally sort of generated, but happiness is that thing that's fleeting. Happiness is the trap. Happiness is what we chase, and then when we become sad, we feel like we failed. But I think joy allows us an opportunity for grief as well. It's part of a full human experience, because to fully thrive and flourish in your life, suffering is a part of it. Suffering builds resiliency. Suffering builds character. Suffering builds strength. Suffering helps you understand what's important. And the reality is, there is no one who has ever lived who has not suffered. If we're talking about what it means to be human, what it means to be human is to suffer. That doesn't mean all life is suffering,
I
but it
know.
does mean that if you live, you will suffer.
Yeah. Yeah.
Everyone who's lived has suffered. And what connects us as humans is that we don't want to suffer. And so, to me, that first noble truth was one I struggled with, because I didn't believe it as a 20-year-old. I'm like, life isn't suffering. Life is beauty and awe and majesty. And then I got older. I'm like, no, life is suffering. Not all life is suffering. Not every moment is suffering. To live isn't necessarily to suffer all the time, but what it means to be human is that you will suffer. And so how do we make sense of this truth? It's not the enemy, it's the teacher. And how do we make sense of it?
So it's not as bleak as it comes off initially.
It's not as bleak. It's not as bleak. Without suffering, you don't get joy, right? Without
True.
sadness, you don't get happiness. Without, tears, you don't get laughter, or you can't appreciate it as much anyway. And so I think we all want to be happy, but the full experience of being human is the experience of going through all of these emotions.
Sure. Now, as the dean of religious life, you carry I mean, it's pressure, I'm sure. It's a lot of pressure. So the Pope makes a statement recently about not being able to bless uh, same-sex unions. And now you have to speak to your Catholic students. What do you say to them? How do you comfort them through that?
Well, I think for young people, they're comfortable in interpreting their faith in a way that makes sense for them. 80% of American Catholics don't agree with the church's stance on, say, contraception, um, yet they don't leave the church, right? Most Catholics were very disappointed with all Catholics probably were very disappointed with the crises in terms of child abuse, but they didn't leave the church. What the Pope said is not new from a doctrinal perspective.
Right.
And I suspect there are a lot of Catholics who will disagree with him, but still not leave the church. We went through many crises at the university, crises of trust, crises of belonging, national crises of abuse over the last 3 or 4 years that shook me to my core. But I decided not to leave the university. Why? Because if you believe in something, you can be part of the change from the inside. And so I have Catholic priest friends who didn't leave the church because they wanted to be part of the change. I didn't leave the university because I believe in the university and I love it and I want to be part of the change. And so I think you don't have to agree with everything to be part of the tribe. Actually, the disagreement makes it more interesting in some ways. It would have been more surprising for him to articulate a different position because what he said was very much doctrinal. But there's no denying that this Pope has brought a lot of young people back into a life of faith. He might not have changed the notes, but he changed the tune, so in some ways, he's focused on other aspects of the church. He's focused on the social justice aspects of the church. He's focused on serving the poor. He's focused on the things that Jesus was focused on too. And so that's brought in a lot of new energy as well. But, for young people, 70-80% of young people are fully supportive of same-sex union. So anything to the contrary is not going to sit well with them. And that's partly why 50% of students are not affiliated with religion, because students see religion as an intractable source of conflict. They see religion as terrorism, as child abuse, as misogyny, as anti-LGBTQ rhetoric, and as casteist. They don't see religion as building hospitals and universities. They don't see religion as liberation theology and personal transformation and introspection. They don't see religion as serving those who are less fortunate. That's all religion, it's a bigger picture. And so our students were raised with if it bleeds, it leads. And if it bleeds in the name of God, it gets the front page narrative. So that's partly why they've left, because they don't see religion living up to its own values.
Right. Or they stay, but they just don't agree with whatever.
Or they don't agree and they try to be the change from the inside, which I think is how institutions change over time. Young people are the driver of institutional change over time.
Do you ever doubt your own faith? And if so, how do you bounce back?
Yeah, I guess I'm sort of not. That's an interesting question. I don't know if I've ever been asked that. I don't necessarily wrestle with doubt anymore. I just try to be more expansive. So I just keep trying to learn more and build my worldview. But I think I'm comfortable with the foundational blocks of that worldview, which are the blocks of my Hindu faith. I belong to a tradition, though, that is super expansive. It is decentralized. In some ways, it is disorganized. It's open to interpretation. And so and I think this is true for everyone, we can creatively interpret our faith in a way that makes sense to us. No one practices their faith exactly the way their parents or grandparents practiced it. Every time a religious tradition moves from one country to another, it changes. Every time it moves across time, it changes. If it was fixed in time, there would be no way for it to be relevant to us now. The religions we don't know about are the ones that are now irrelevant because they weren't malleable. They weren't open to interpretation. They couldn't be creatively reinterpreted. And so I want all of our students to feel, and young people to feel empowered to interpret their tradition in a way that makes sense to them. There's no way to literally interpret any of our texts. Our texts are antithetical to each other. What is the Bible? Is it turn the other cheek, or is it an eye for an eye? Well, it's both. The way you read the Bible tells you more about who you are than it tells you about what the text is. It's a mirror to your own values.
How do you how do you know that you're living your life the right way ever?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the question is, what is the right way, right? What does it mean to live your life in the right way? I don't know if there's an answer to that, but that's why the questions are important, right? That's why the questions are important. Maybe one day I feel like I am, maybe one day I'm not, but the question remains, what is the right way? That's the journey. That's life. Life is a journey. It's not a destination. We're blinded by the destination, but the beauty is in the walking.
Okay. So then that dispels my next question, which was going to be, if you could ask a question that you would get the answer to, like for certain, to a higher power, to whatever, higher power you believe in, what would it be? Would you want to know the answer, or would you want to continue to experience this journey?
I don't know if I want to know an answer, honestly, because the question, like I said, the questions are part of the process. If you have the answer, then where's the growth? Where's the journey? Where's the transformation? You don't appreciate any answer that you're given. If you cheat on a test, you probably don't appreciate it as much as if you've studied for that test and you've come to it on your own. So I think you devalue that thing which is easy or given, and you really value the thing which comes with struggle and work. And so any answer that you're given is probably not an answer you would embrace.
That was good. That was good. Okay. Can you show us real quick your, I don't know if I'm going to pronounce this correctly, Sikh Kara, and tell us
Oh,
what,
yes. So
and
this
what it
is
means?
a Kara. It's right here. This is a symbol of the Sikh faith. I'm not Sikh, but I am Punjabi, and I have a lot of Sikh family members. This is one of the 5 articles of faith. It stands for strength, and historically they were much bigger, and they were used to protect your wrist during sword play. Mine's much smaller because my days of sword play are over.
Thank you for that. And one last thing, how do you pray?
Yeah, I pray, but in my own ways too, right? I meditate, but in my own ways. I don't think every prayer has to be in a temple, and I don't think every meditation has to be on the mat.
Right.
The real question is, can you find a moment of mindfulness when you're with your family? Can you have a prayer of gratitude when you're on your bike? Can you take a second to watch the sunset? And how is that like a prayer? I spent some time with Steph Curry. We did a Facebook watch together, Steph versus the game, and we talked about his jump shot as an act of devotion, his jump shot as a
Uh,
prayer. So I think there are different ways for us to pray. In some ways, our life can be a prayer, our life can be an affirmation, our life can be a meditation.
that was beautiful. Thank you so much. I'm fresh out of questions for you, but
Yeah.
not for the universe.
Well, thank you, Karina, for
Thank
reaching out and for doing this. I'm so proud of you and your success. You're such a light in the world when we need it most.
Thank you.
You're impacting more people than you realize, and I can't wait till our paths cross again.
Thank you so much. That means the world to me coming from you. I appreciate you. Thank you for being on Guide and Seek. Get it? Guide and Seek.
Perfect. Love it.